Welcome to Healing Solidarity, the conference about reimagining international development. I'm Marion Clements, initiator of this conference, writer and consultant, and facilitator of the Replenishment Room. And in this conversation, I talk with Marion Osieyo about what it means to bring our inner life into our work, why love is her way of doing politics, and the kind of spaces we need in international development to shift our practice and the way we show up to our work. I love the depth and breadth of this conversation, and I hope you'll really enjoy listening to it too. So hi, and welcome to Healing Solidarity, and I'm excited to be here talking to Marion Osieyo. Hi. So let's just start by telling people a bit about who you are and where you are right now. I think you're at work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Marion Osieyo. I am a writer and a specialist in global development cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm currently based in the UK, but I was born and raised in Kenya, East Africa. So I've previously worked for a couple of organizations, mainly I worked in the US Congress for placement. I did a stint at the UK Civil Service. Then I worked for a few years at the Cherie Blair Foundation for Women, and I'm currently working at WWF UK, convening a global community of practice working on the Sustainable Development Goals. I have so many passions and interests, which I hope we can explore with Marianne. And the topic of healing solidarity is something that I think is so relevant, but also especially urgent for our mission in international development. Thank you for the invitation, Marianne, and hope to get into it.
Let's get into it. Great. So I was introduced to you by a colleague of ours, like a mutual colleague, but I then had to look at your website and your writing, and I was really interested in some of the stuff I saw there, and I thought maybe we'd jump in and just start talking a little bit about the idea of how we decolonize development and your thoughts around that, because I think it's really pertinent to a lot of the things we've been talking about in the conference with the other speakers as well. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Right. Where do I start? I think the conversation on decolonizing development, it's at the base level is starting from a desire to acknowledge that the ways in which the histories of our sector have come from a place of inequity and power imbalances, and in order for us to move towards a vision of equality, of inclusion, we really need to look at these foundations and acknowledge them as they are. There is no one way to decolonize anything. It's really dependent on the situation, it's dependent on the site of violence, as it were. It's really dependent on the experiences and what is needed to move towards a decolonial place. So there is no kind of universal solution as to what is needed to decolonize the international development sector.
Sure.
But I think we cannot move towards that conversation before having the initial step, which is to acknowledge that, our histories are informing our current present and will continue to live on into our future unless we choose to do something about it. And I think as a sector, we're still in that initial conversation of acknowledging these truths. And that's why it's important to, as much as you can, to initiate these conversations in your organizations, in your communities, in your relationships, and to really be cognizant of them. And I think once we get to kind of a collective acceptance of that, then we can move towards it. But before we do that, unless we do that, we're just going to be at this initial conversation of, people either denying or, like either accepting or trying to verify or trying to prove that there are colonial practices or there have been within our sector. So that's what's currently sitting with me in terms of this conversation. How can we get to a collective understanding and acceptance of the colonial practices in our work and in the history of our sector, and acknowledging that collectively before we go to the next step?
Yeah. One of the things I see is that it hasn't been our practice. Like, I've been in the sector maybe for 20 years. It hasn't been our practice to acknowledge these things between ourselves very much. So I think, although I think a lot of people would acknowledge that there is, colonialism in our practice when they sort of think about it, there hasn't been that practice of really making that part and parcel of how we figure out what to do next. It's been a lot of like going around the issue and maybe talking about like, we should be listening to local voices, or we should, like these kinds of things that aren't quite calling it what it is, right?
Yeah. And, I think the element of discomfort in that, it comes from complicity.
Yeah.
Who is the we that's doing all these things?
Yeah. Yeah.
Who are they? It has to be me and you, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's no us and them, and that complicity is kind of really difficult sometimes to face. Like this thing that I really do not want to see, or I don't want our sector to have. I'm also complicit in perpetuating it.
Yeah.
And decolonizing isn't just about addressing structures and systems. It's also agency. Power is produced through agency. It's a reproduction of a relationship that requires subject and object. And in order for us to address these issues, we have to also accept an element of complicity, and that's really difficult to unpack and to accept at the individual level. So maybe that's why we kind of skirt around it. I'm sure there are many other kind of reasons and incentives for not challenging any form of power imbalance, or any kind of power imbalance in any situation, but maybe that's one of the reasons.
Yeah, and so a way to do this differently, I guess, is to be willing to face that, I guess, right? That complicity in ourselves, a bit of us that's maybe profiting from the privilege that's afforded to us within these structures, that wants to sort of only see the sort of benevolence or something in us, or the goodness, or whatever that is, right? Practically, for people listening that are thinking, okay, I'd like to understand what that looks like. What do you think that looks like for an individual, but also maybe within organizations?
What does decolonizing development look like?
I guess I mean, like, if somebody's wanting to change their practice around this, right? Wanting to acknowledge for themselves their complicity. I mean, maybe it is as simple as a thought shift, but I guess I'm thinking, like, within an organization, how do you start to make that thought shift happen? Maybe we can just talk about it between us. Is it something that you try to incorporate in the work that you do at the moment?
I think, this is a really interesting question. There's we have kind of the practical recommendations, as it were. Every advocacy objective needs to have a recommendation.
Right.
There's the challenging our relationships, or the way how donors influence our relationships. It's like you were saying, participatory approaches to designing projects. It's all of those practical recommendations, right? But I firmly believe that anytime you are trying to shift a power dynamic in any manifestation, and in this context it's around kind of colonial practices, you really need to meet people where they are. It's the personal experience, right? It's really it's really meeting people at the relational level that you start to change things. This is how social change has worked. It's not been through a kind of a savvy tech innovation initiative. It's been through the relational. It's been through people coming together and relating together on an issue that they change. So in an organizational level, it's speaking to someone at the level at which they're at. And it's not being afraid to initiate those conversations, but doing it in a way that you move together towards something. I think it's important to name injustice and to challenge it, but that cannot be the end. That cannot be where you stop at just by calling out something. You have to find a way in which to form a relationship in order to move it beyond, and to really get people on your side. So in an organization level, I would say, let's say there's an organizational policy in the way that you relate with kind of partner organizations around the world, and that makes you feel uncomfortable because it's perpetuating a power imbalance which feels colonial to you or feels just deeply unequal. Right. Starting from a position of asking why these are in place, and then seeking to understand how that organization or that individual sees these policies or sees these structures. And then from then, once you build a map of how they view the world, then you can actually go to present an alternative kind of perspective. But it can't just be confrontational, it can't be binary, because I think that actually allows you to get anywhere, because what you have is essentially one person asserting their view of the world and another person asserting their other view of the world. That's why I think it's critical to develop these relational skills of addressing conflict in a transformational way, of opening up spaces where you can think together with people in not in a confrontational way, or not in a way that you kind of silence yourself, but actually being comfortable with conflict. You both have opposing views, but you still want to get somewhere together. And I think it's those kind of spaces that do bring something forward. It's also very difficult to assign, like, this is one practical way that I do it, initiating conversations at a relational level, because in order for me to want to change your perspective, I have to really meet you where you are. So this is how I do it in a situation, however uncomfortable for me or for the other person. But I understand when issues are kind of more structural. So, if you're, for example, the UN peacekeeper scandal, that's been going on for however many years. In there are many elements to that kind of scandal which are colonial, and how does someone at the UN initiate this kind of conversation, knowing what we know now, which is that whistleblowers were really kind of punished for coming forward. So it's hard for me as an individual to give like a one universal kind of recommendation.
Sure.
Every situation is so personal and so unique to its context. But I firmly believe in navigating conflict from a relational perspective, and not always an ideological kind of way of challenging people's ideas or viewpoints or or perspectives. So that's one way. I hope that makes sense.
No, it does, and I think it's useful because I think sometimes people struggle to think about, like, how do I move forward with something that I'm feeling, and I think there are and certainly some of the other speakers have spoken about, like, there are some barriers to some of that within some organizations where, like, your feelings or your opinions of or your sense of something not being right isn't necessarily valued, but I think, like, thinking about it as something that you do within relationship rather than kind of as a binary, I think it's really a really useful way of thinking about it. Like, and I think it helps to think, like, so if we're, the way that structures and systems work is that to some extent we're probably all complicit in them. And so I think that that sense that you brought at the beginning of the conversation about that is really helpful as well, because, like, if we understand that we've all got a level of complicity, which might vary, then the question becomes, how do we move together, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. I saw something else on your website around asking different questions, which I also thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
And very valid, and I don't remember exactly what your words were, but I think you were speaking to the fact that we're often asking maybe a certain kind of question in development. What works. And I really enjoyed your take on that. So would you like to speak a bit to your take on why that might not be quite the right question to be asking all the time?
What works? We're just trying to figure it out all the time. And the challenge with that is that whatever we want to work is constantly changing, right? So,
right.
So it's I want to, first of all, I love asking questions. I've been like this since I was a small girl. Like, this is who I am. And as I grew up, I grew older, and growing as a person in this sector, you kind of, we value experts, we value knowledge and people who have the answers, we deify them. And so I sometimes I used to just feel very I didn't feel that it was okay for me not to know something, or okay for me to ask questions, because we place such high value on the experts and people who have the answers. And in truth is that people who do have the answers are the ones that ask a lot of questions, because then they take time to actually find the answer. So on the one hand, I kind of want to push back against the culture which stops us from asking questions. And I think curiosity is a really important, don't want to use it as like a skill, the skill for the workplace in 2020, but I think it's a really important skill, especially for our sector. You can never assume that you know a situation fully, because you don't. People are very different, and you have to have that curious mindset in everything that you do, because you don't want to make assumptions about things, because that might just have really bad implications, not just for your work, but for the relationships you build in the community. And so I want to, asking questions for me is one form of kind of pushing back against the culture that it's placing more value on answers than questions. And at the second level, I think it's an important skill to have because of the nature of the work that we do. And I think it's important to always be asking questions, not just about the work that you do, but about why people live the way they live and why people think the way they think, and do the things they do. And then at the third level, I think asking questions is a skill in itself. And because our sector is focused so much on finding what works, we forget to ask other types of questions that can lead us to more transformative answers, you know? And so I'm always trying to improve the way I ask questions. Because I literally think we are shaped by the questions we ask.
Right, absolutely.
So it's really important to just build that as a skill, and to always think, is there another question I can ask about the situation, and what could the answers be? And this isn't like an intellectual task or anything like this. It's really just on a practical level. Going into a situation, the way you frame the question you ask frames the answers you get. And so it really is vital to think thoroughly, or think more deeply about the kind of questions you ask. And so, yeah, that's why those are my opinions on asking questions. But I think it's really an important skill to have a philosophy, I guess, of looking at the world, and being comfortable with not knowing is really important, especially in the kind of world that we live in, which is deeply complex and ever-changing. It's okay not to know things. It's okay to, and not know in an ignorant way, like I don't want to know, but not know as in this situation is beyond my current lived experience of reality, and I'm okay with that. But I want to ask questions so I can get to another level of reality. That's what I think about questions. And in relation to our sector, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it occurs to me as you're speaking, like one way in which maybe a colonialism might manifest is in the questions we ask, right? That like, if we're asking the same questions, you know, we're going to get certain kinds of answers. And there's a way in which who's asking the questions as well is crucial, right?
Yeah. And who has the legitimacy to ask questions? Yeah, it's a lot of, and what kind of, and we're going to go into a whole different sphere about knowledge production and development, and
go on.
I don't want to reduce this. I don't want to go into a conversation about quantitative and qualitative research methods and all of that. But, you know, that's all part of knowledge. Is such a, it's a resource for power, and it's also a form of power in itself. But yeah, the kind of questions we ask also informs the kind of tools that we use to find the answers or get the answers, and that also informs what we think are legitimate forms of finding that answer and illegitimate forms. There's so many bodies of knowledge that we discount in our sector that are so valid and so necessary and so important. Indigenous knowledge, I mean, really, I can go on to this, but
go ahead, please.
I just, our sector is essentially about people. We're constantly curious about people and knowing who they are, and knowing what good means for them, what is important for them, what is needed for them to have a quality of life that they can call a life. So we also need to understand that from the way in which they have seen life and experienced life, and the knowledge, the language they use to build that understanding about their life. And if we come in with our tools and we decide this is what we consider to be good life, and this is the language that we use, and this is this is our knowledge of what is a good life. I just think, how can we fulfill our mission if this is, that's our approach to it, you know? So yeah, sorry, I'm just digressing onto something else.
It's okay. I think it's it's really important for us to ask those questions, to come back to questions, right? About like whose understanding of what a good life or whatever, you know, a good life for want of a better way of putting it, or whose understanding of what the end goal are we actually focused on, right? And I think it is fairly regularly that I see things where, although people might have been consulted or there might have been a focus group or some sort of like question at the beginning, the questions were framed in a certain way to be about a certain issue that maybe an agency in the global north is interested in. And so the answers are, you know, narrowed by the questions to such an extent that actually what people really might want for themselves in their lives is kind of a very long way away from what's actually being posited by a project delivered by an NGO. So I think it's
and that goes for research agendas, and you know, when people fund, you know, when you're looking to apply for a research funding, the scope for questioning is very much shaped by the person that's funding it. And I mean, it's something that's so fundamental to the work that we do, and it cuts across so many different spheres of our work, from research to policy, to advocacy, to programs. So I think it's important to think about the kind of questions that you ask of your work, and you ask to your work, and you ask in order to fulfill your work. That's why I'm passionate about questions. But I'm also just a really curious person, and I ask way too many questions.
It sounds to me like that's a gift that you have that we need to hear about. So thank you for sharing it. When I asked you about what you thought about the future for international development and what it might need to heal, there's three things you talked about, and I just wanted to us to explore them a little bit.
Sure.
So, and we spoke to this a little bit already, but you talked about spaces and embodied practice for contemplative approaches.
Sorry, that's a long-winded one.
It's okay.
And I was situating those responses within the question about what needs to change, or what needs to be within us. I'm curious to see how, as a sector, we can merge inner life and outer life in our work. And by inner life, I mean, I don't know how to explain. It's so like second knowledge to me because I'm working so hard at it, but to other people I'm like, oh, what's that inner life? I think of inner life from a spiritual perspective, but you can also think about it from how you experience you can also think of it. It's not a binary between personal and social. It's not that binary. So I enter the inner life from a spiritual perspective. So what are the practices that allow me to connect to myself, to a higher sense of being, and to the work that I do, because they're all interconnected in my head. But embodied practices, it's also from a practical level, I think it's important element of self-care, because if the kind of work that we do requires you to give a lot of your personal self to it, and you can run the risk of prioritizing the mission to an extent where it's detrimental to your well-being and to your health. And so I don't want to denigrate self-care, but I don't want to talk about, when I say self-care, I don't mean bubble bath and I don't know,
massage.
Yes, and that's super nice.
Yeah.
But I mean truly taking time to see your inner self as a whole complete universe, because it really is. There is nobody else in this world that's going to experience and know and understand what's going on within you apart from yourself. So it really is a complete universe from everybody else. And it's taking time to develop the practices that will allow you to be in touch with that. And then see how this inner universe within you is informing the way you see and experience your outer world. And without having a firm connection between the two, you can end up doing work that is destructive to others, but also it can be destructive to you. Or you can end up doing work that's truly transformative and changing people's lives, but it's at the detriment of your own well-being and yourself. So I rarely kind of see this kind of conversation happening within high power places. And when I mean that in multilateral institutions, which is a site of power, you know, from the design of the buildings to the way in which forums are held and all of that. It's really a high power place, literally. And so I wonder, how do people gather themselves to be in these kind of spaces? And I would love to see that conversation unfolding. And when we talk about this inner life within international development sector, it's often within the context of something negative happening, you know, burnout, disillusionment, depression, you know, people going on, you know, long-term humanitarian missions and crashing. But why do we need to always talk about this conversation within that context? Why can we not have a positive conversation about it? And yeah, I would really, that for me is something that I think is desperately needed within our sector. And I'm curious to see how bringing more embodied practices, how that can change our sector and the way which we see each other and engage with each other. And I do believe that the more we have and assimilate embodied practices in our ways of working, we will also see more relational ways of being and interacting with others in our work. And so, yeah, that's what I'm curious and hopeful to see in the future in our sector. Yeah.
I just want to say amen to that.
We eventually got there. Yeah. Are you what is
I'm in total agreement with you, and I think for me, I've begun to think of it as like we need an understanding of that, what you're calling in inner life or our personal. I think there's a number of things in that. You know, there's like our own well-being, and then there's like our integrity.
Yes.
You know, there's acknowledgement of our own kind of blind spots and complicity and stuff. For me, that they're kind of in there, and it's all about this piece of how do we turn to ourselves in order to turn back to our work with I think I would call it, with that inner life with us rather than cutting it off, because I think that a lot of what happens in our sector is probably not unique to our sector, but I think it's particularly maybe problematic in our sector is like when we're cut off from all of that, or we're trying to push that away, then we can end up acting in ways that, like you said, completely, you've said it already, aren't good for us, aren't good for the work. And that's when we tend to fall into these traps of actually we're replicating systems of oppression in the ways we're working, while we're saying we're working for justice and peace and poverty eradication and stuff.
Absolutely. And that's what I really speaks to me about the title of this conference, Healing Solidarity. I think what needs to heal within, when we talk about solidarity, is viewing solidarity as an end and not just a means to an end. And that means, I think Congressman John Lewis said this once when he was talking about the civil rights movement, and he was saying, you know, we had to, I think I wrote it down somewhere. Yeah, you have to have this sense of faith that what you're moving towards is already done, it's already happened. You have to live solidarity as if it's happening now, and not just something that you need in order to, you know, we need to mobilize people. And then when we mobilize, we're going to get 1 million voters, then we're going to get, no, it's actually what you were working towards. You're working towards a vision of a collective of people living the same way and living a vision that is true to your mission. And that requires you to embody the things that you want, or the things that you think you need in order to be able to, like, to live in solidarity in the future. You have to live it now. And it's really baffling that we want to achieve equality and inclusion through means of exclusion and violence. Like, it baffles me. But that's also the challenge of change, because we're living in systems and we're living in relationships that we want to transform, and we can't move outside of them in order to do that. So we have to live within them, whilst also trying to bring about a different form of relationship and a different form of structures. And the challenge is that you can replicate them in order to get to the end means, but that's not going to be change. That's just going to be a different manifestation of the same thing.
Right.
You know, if I want to achieve gender equality by oppressing everyone who doesn't want to have that's not going to achieve the change that I desire for myself or desire for the world. So it's really interesting, solidarity and re-envisioning it as well. I think that's something else that I think needs change.
Yeah, and in the ideas that you sent me beforehand, you talked about an updated model and vision of the world. Which and I just wanted to hear a bit more about what you meant by that, because I had some thoughts and then I realized that those were sort of probably my assumptions. What were you thinking?
We're currently addressing 21st century challenges with 20th century institutions. And our sector came from a different time in history, which had a different understanding and conceptualization of the world. And I'm not just talking about borders and geographies and, you know, a time before WhatsApp and Facebook and hyperconnectivity. I think in the 20th century, the grand vision for the world was a world of peace, which in essence, what a world of peace really was a world which is devoid of war, because we just ended World War II, and that's where the UN and all these multilaterals came together. But that was our grand vision for the world, a world which has absence of war. And fast forward till now, we just have different challenges, and it's not to say that there are no wars, because there still are, but our vision and our understanding of our world has really changed. And so the different kind of models or visions of the world, which I think speak to our challenges now, a world that understands the relationship between society, our politics, and the environment, and that wasn't something that we were having a conversation about when the sector was starting. You know, it was a conversation between North and South, global North and global South. That was really what the world was. So that's a different vision of the world that I think our institutions really need to speak to. I think also something that I've previously said before in terms of meeting people in a relational way. Our world is so much more complex. I think there's so many unknowns, and I don't think the structures that we use, debates, just binary ways of seeing the world, I don't think they're applicable to our society anymore. Just even down to these terms, global North and global South, they're not applicable to us anymore, because there's a huge spectrum of that. Beyond that, there's so many different categories of the way countries order themselves now, and it's just outdated. But it still speaks to the power imbalances, but it's still outdated. So I think what's one thing that's needed in our world, or the way we can see the world, is how we encounter people. Because there's so many unknowns, you can't encounter the world with this kind of rigid sense of, things, and this is how people are, and this is where UK is, and this is how British people are. It's not that fixed anymore. A lot of things are fluid and constantly changing. And I think trying to develop a sense of wanting to encounter people, and when I mean encounter, I mean really looking to see people for who they are, and being curious, again, back to the curiosity mindset, but just really being curious about situations and people, being comfortable with complexity and the unknown. These are the things that are needed for our world, or to really experience our world the way it is, and not the way it was in the mid-20th century. Yeah, I don't know what much more to say about this, but
it makes sense to me. It makes sense to me. I think there's something really valuable in what you said about how our institutions are basically outdated,
Yeah.
Or at least are operating with an outdated kind of conceptualization of the world we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And so there's something that needs to shift there. And I think it'd be really, again, it's about the questions you ask as well, isn't it? But like what be really interesting to kind of really, for organizations to really engage with that and think about, okay, so what is it that's different, and how would we need to be set up differently, effectively set up differently to do that? I want to ask you about the last thing you said.
Oh, yes.
You know what it is? Yeah. Reclaiming politics as the work of manifesting love.
Yes, I am into that.
Tell me a bit more about what it means for you.
So last year I volunteered at this amazing, incredibly just wonderful, just brilliant organization called Women at the Well, and they are a support center for women exiting street-based prostitution in London. And I don't often like to speak about my experience there, because I don't want to center my work of service around my experience, if that makes sense. It's not about me. But it was a really transformative experience, because it challenged so many perceptions I had about politics, social change, what being an ally truly means. I think for a while, I would say allyship for me was more about expressing my political ideologies than about really being there for other people and being in solidarity with them. And so when I was a volunteer at Women at the Well, it wasn't so much about what I stood for, or just so much of our social change conversation right now is about your ideologies. Are you this? Are you that? Are you feminist? Are you this? Are you it's where's our conversation about the work, and so when I was at the Well, it wasn't about those things. It was really the only way I could be political, as in express or manifest my agency, was to be love, really listening to people, really showing care when they speak, finding ways to work through very difficult, at times dangerous situations, being on time. Was really the only way I could be. And it was then I learned how to really slow down. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's not a hashtag campaign. It's not those things are very, having a hashtag go viral is very important for spreading your message, but that's not what does the work. Especially when you're talking about individuals who are really looking to change their lives and are going through some really transformative and very traumatic experiences. It's really being there side by side with them that counts and that matters, and that is where the change manifests. And I think that's what also shifted my point of view in terms of seeing the world from a relational perspective. And it just made me realize so many things. I could articulate my arguments or perspectives very well about my views on sex work or prostitution, but I wouldn't know how to relate to someone going through that, and that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Why is I'm not articulate at the work that I'm meant to be doing, and so I really started to lean into this thought that there could be a different vision of politics beyond what we have now, which is very short-term, very reactionary, very binary, fear-based, and there could be something different. Instead of development cooperation, we could have development co-creation. We could have a different form of politics at the national and international level. And so that's when I started to really lean into this idea of politics as love. And when we think of politics, we think of it in terms of power and a vehicle for negotiating and exchanging power. But social change needs power and love, and there is a different model for that. And love in itself, I think, is power in a different type of form. And so I've just been really leaning into that, leaning into that, and just thinking that could be something that we explore as a sector, that the spaces we build to make decisions, the public spaces we have for negotiating what we deem as power, could be actually other forms of, we could envision them into different ways and different ways of being and relating to each other. And so that's where I thought of like politics as love. That's possible, and it's real, and it's urgent, and it does work, and it can work, and it will work. And I know it can work, and I know it will work, because this is the backbone of all the social movements we've had in the past. It's been one person going through something and a collective group of people deciding that in order for that person to continue being the way everybody is, needs to also change. That's love. That's not anything beyond that. And so I think I'm very grateful for that experience of being able to serve at Women at the Well. And it's also a philosophy it's a question that I'm living at the moment, and I'm okay with not being able to articulate it concretely into what that looks like at the UN or at an NGO or in a community. But I'm also really revived because I know this is the formula that has worked in the past to bring about transformative change. So it's possible, and it's okay to figure it out for the current and future challenges. So that's what I mean by politics as a work of manifesting love.
I love that. It reminds me of what you were saying before about the inner life and kind of embodied practice and stuff. And like it feels like that's connected to in some way. And like you said, I don't need to be exact about it. I love that. I love your call to not have all the answers because it's such a relief.
It's a relief, but it's also being open to receiving those answers.
Yeah.
The next interaction I have on the street could tell me the answer. The next piece of work I do, the next mistake I make could be the answer to this question that I'm living with. And so I have to be okay with not knowing it, because it gives me that room to continue searching or to continue being open to receiving that answer. And I think it's that old school model of having to know everything and having to, it's a form of control that's really based on fear, you know? And it doesn't push, from a personal level, it doesn't push me to the edge of my boundaries if I'm only comfortable living and existing within what I know. So I have to be okay with not knowing, otherwise I'm not able to go beyond my existing limits. So that's why I'm a lot more okay with not knowing, and a lot of that was giving myself and taking permission to not know. So if someone asks me a question I don't know, I actually don't know. That's what I'll respond, and I will then follow up with, can you help me find that answer, or can we find that answer together? But I don't want to be someone who doesn't engage with things they don't know about, and I don't want to foster a culture where we're only limited by the things that we know of. So yeah, that's why I'm comfortable with saying that now. It wasn't so much in the past.
Yeah, I think it's a really helpful frame for people, and as is your thoughts about politics as love, which I'm going to be sitting with for sure. And we will share your articles about some of these things, because I know you've written about some of them on your website. Do you want to just say what your website is for people who are listening?
Yes, it's just my name, so www.marionosieyo.com, and there's a contact form there, so please feel free to contact me there. I'm also on Twitter. My handle is at Marion, MARION _AO, and I'm always open to any sort of contact and any questions you're living with that you want to share. And I just want to say, Marianne, thank you so much for opening the space about healing solidarity, and just trying to have us make the connection between what goes on in here and what's happening out there. Because we often don't make time to really explore that. And I think this is truly necessary for the sector. And beyond that, not just for our sector as kind of a unit, but for the mission that we are all trying to achieve. And so, yeah, I'm very grateful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm super grateful that you took time to be here with me today as well, Marion. So thank you so much. It was great talking with you.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to me, Marion Clements, in conversation with Marion Osieyo, and this is the Healing Solidarity Conference. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to spend a bit more time with the ideas, suggestions and thoughts we discuss in this talk or any of the others in Healing Solidarity, don't forget you can make a contribution to support the production of this conference, and you'll get access to recordings and ongoing conversations about these themes and ideas. Just click the link below the video to find out more. Thank you.